Welcome to the endgame, specifically the grinder endgame. This is the simul dosing grinder designed for the FAS 2000 series. This here is the Weber GMK2 model, and we have thoroughly tested it while also taking a closer look at its features, because there are many positive reports about this grinder. So how positive, or what's our perspective on the grinder? Key topics in this video. Between us stands the Weber Key MK2 Dear Michel, and we've given it a very thorough examination. We made a lot of espresso, various espressos. We pulled extractions, of course. We measured particle distribution. We looked at extractions. So we looked at how it changes with light roasts, with dark roasts, also in comparison to other extractions or other grinders, because we wanted to understand this specific grinder. Because in specific areas it behaves rather differently compared to anything else we've analyzed up to this point. And indeed, we had to diligently work our way into this subject matter so that we could confidently dare to produce this video today in the specific manner we're planning to present it. Because we're done with the test anyway. We can actually speak openly and freely here, like we always do. We went ahead and bought the grinder, and we're very eager to share with you all the exciting details of what we discovered. Before we delve into the taste and particle distribution, Michel, this grinder accomplishes a lot. Very correct, very good, very elegant, and it is very, very high quality. What can you tell us about your experiences with the key? Hey.
She was also at my place for 4 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, because I really then realized that I had to have a very deep conversation with this grinder and understand it. And I completely agree with you. Processing, I don't think there's been much I've had so far that's been processed this cleanly. It all feels very high quality. So let's get started. I'm not typically a fan of any small tools, but it surprisingly comes with a little brush inside. And because when you insert them like that, the brush is moved to the left side, then there's a cover on top, and afterwards you slide it back in. It's all high quality. The entire burr cone, so we're talking about an 83 cone from Matza. Maybe you'll stumble upon them from time to time, especially when you're on a lovely holiday in wonderful Italy and encounter those gigantic Masa grinders positioned on the table, standing at a height roughly the same as I am tall. Inside, you'll frequently discover this kind of grinding cone.
I think in the Rober. In the Rober, exactly. Really big things. We also had 3 of them. You could potentially utilize it as a grinder or even as an anchor for your boat, considering that it was genuinely so enormously large. Large and hefty and quite weighty, and that's being utilized here as well. Conical in shape.
Conical, and initially there was the first version of the grinder available, which featured a slightly different lid design and also a different container at the bottom. A few updates and improvements were made along the way, and now we have the latest updated version of it. For instance, you can either open this lid just halfway or you can completely take it off. There's slightly more space available for the coffee inside. Exactly, there are many aspects of it that are simply just extremely high quality.
I'd like to begin by discussing one of the unique features that make this grinder especially exceptional. That's the volume. It's the quietest grinder we've measured so far. We are at 67 decibels. That's really amazing. So that's actually below 70. I truly don't believe I've ever measured a grinder before. It is astonishingly and incredibly quiet for a grinder. I do think it has a bit to do with the construction. There's no question about it. And it actually reminds me of something quite specific. I sort of get the impression that it's really quite similar to a hand grinder, you know? Well, they often feature conical grinders. Naturally, they're a bit on the smaller side. And here we've got ourselves a really big fat one. We very likely couldn't turn an 83mm disc by hand at all. But ultimately, it's about the underlying principle. So that's what it actually looks like inside there. And that leads me to the second point. Hand grinders usually tend to have a minimal or negligible amount of dead space. And we don't have that either.
Yes. And no. So
first say yes, and then I'll say no.
So yeah, absolutely no permanent retention here. To be quite honest, I've genuinely never come across any electronic grinder where there's absolutely nothing at all for me to scrape out. And just to provide some context, we consistently measure the exchangeable retention, which remains in a closed grinder with drivers inside the grinding chamber, but continuously mixes with the new coffee being added.
You sometimes refer to it as temporary retention. So if you come across the terms exchangeable or temporary retention, we use them interchangeably with the same meaning.
Certainly, here's a revised version. Yes. Then there's always some retention that just tends to stay stuck in the screws of the grinding discs or on the drive elements, simply adhering somewhere in the tunnel or along the path from the tunnel until it eventually comes down. But we don't have that issue here at all. I found absolutely nothing that I could even attempt to scrape away. So no retention, really none at all. So if we say 0.0 with extremely little behind it because I had nothing to scrape off. And then there is the theoretically replaceable one. And that's mainly due to the static charge of the grinder's ground material.
Yes, but I would now also briefly include what was constructed there as well, Michel, because that's truly something we have now received as a significant additional improvement with this newer model. Coffee often tends to get jammed there.
Exactly. You actually have to imagine it like a hand grinder. It grinds between the cones, meaning the outer and inner grinding cone. The inner one is at the bottom. There's a fine gap in between where the coffee comes out.
Till then, no retention.
We did.
That's where everything gets revealed. And then the question arises, what ends up happening to this coffee, from the grinding process to the portafilter? And then all of a sudden, we do have a little bit.
Exactly. Some of it gets caught in this gap due to static charge. And there is, I would say, a sort of WDT tool situated in this magic tumbler, if you can refer to it as such. It's essentially a wire mesh contraption that works to fluff up the coffee grounds quite nicely once more, ensuring it's evenly distributed and ready for use. Fluffed up and actually scraped away from the edge. And along this gap, as well as its edges, coffee tends to stick. And then there's a paper feeder device that wipes it away. However, due to the static charge, some of it tends to get stuck to the feeder and inside the gap.
We're discussing 0.3, right?
We've taken it out of proportion, but in truth, it's actually just very minimal. And I believe that's a significant difference. It is quite clearly visible. I can really see it. For example, at home, I consciously took the initiative to take the cup off, put it back on, and then remove it once more. A gentle tap or a light knock on the table typically results in a considerable amount to already come off. Or I've provided a brush, and theoretically, you could certainly use that one as an alternative.
Sure, just a quick context. 0.2 ranks among the top grinders for retention. No question. You can see the retention, it's really great, then you can use that. And yet, if you don't do anything with it, it just falls awkwardly and inevitably ends up around the grinder. 0.2 grams might not necessarily be the determining factor for your brew, but it still impacts the overall process. But I think for the aesthetics around it, it's just like that. And then you don't want to... I notice you fiddling around with the brush over there. That's not exactly enjoyable, is it? So then the question arises, how do I manage to transfer this? From the guitar string into the tumbler successfully.
And there we are at another point. That's workflow.
Yeah, maybe we should briefly look at the structure and workflow again. Before we take a look at the other levels, we will also talk about the temperature. We'll talk more about the warming and similar topics. But let's just quickly go over how exactly are we going to handle this situation now.
Therefore, if you plan to grind your coffee in the normal way, without the water spray we'll discuss in further detail later, you can easily attach the lid to the top with magnets. You have the option to toss in the coffee and then press it down, or alternatively, you can arrange it to open to the side. You can, for example, I actually tried it myself as well, just because sometimes there's a bit of popcorning, which means coffee that occasionally tends to fly out through this tiny little hole. And I then just went ahead and tried putting it over in this way, while pouring the coffee into the back. And then that effectively prevents it, so you could actually just leave that one hanging nicely above and use the other one conveniently below. That's all still cleverly thought out.
Honestly, the entire experience is truly delightful. The way these magnets effortlessly click together is really amazing. That's not the situation here. It's not even that there's another magnet somewhere else, but you can clearly feel that the magnets are perfectly suited to the weight. That gives the impression of a really nice fluid work experience to begin with. Although, or let's rather say, everything feels great initially in terms of material technology and craftsmanship. The workflow is a bit more complex.
Exactly, because you're putting the coffee into it, aren't you? And then it processes it by thoroughly grinding. Since we're working with exceptionally low RPMs, you can reduce it down to a mere 30 revolutions per minute. We actually need to every 2 seconds.
Yes, it's a hand grinder, a cozy hand grinder. I told you, yes.
Very cozy.
150 is already a hand grinder with plenty of caffeine first.
Exactly. And normally, the factory settings we received were 90. So more or less, we actually took the samples of the particles with that, and that's essentially the way it is. Then it takes some time, about 90, until this coffee is fully processed and grinded.
Yes, we can specifically say that it takes somewhere around 25 seconds to have all 18 grams completely ground, or in other words, 8.1 grams in the span of 10 seconds. That's our comparison time frame, and it is indeed the second slowest grinder we've ever thoroughly examined. Only the VS3 was slower. Good, but that's also somehow part of the workflow. Let's continue with the workflow.
And then I dealt with it at home in this manner. I ground the coffee and then I attentively listened to it. And then you can talk wonderfully while doing it. That's nice. With guests, it's really like this. It doesn't interrupt a conversation because it's so quiet. I then unclamped the portafilter, gave it a rinse and cleaned it. And then waited a little bit longer, and then the coffee was finally ready. And then you take this cup out. And sometimes I would go ahead and do a few more spontaneous clips once again.
You must pull harder to detach it from the magnet.
Exactly, but also well managed. And there's another one at the bottom.
How is it? It's probably easier if you slightly twist it off like this, instead of just pulling a slight twist. Look at this elegance. But see, now we have this creature here, and we have to weave it out like that.
Exactly, we need to exit like that. However, it surprisingly performs quite impressively well. I was completely unable to ever break it even once, despite having made a significant number of brews with it.
Certainly, and then we have our freshly prepared coffee in this tumbler. We can then proceed to securely place it back on the portafilter once again as well. And we can already say we've also conducted tests with such devices. This way you can pretty well get the coffee back into the portafilter. Erna Trosberg used this method at the German Barista Championship in 2012 or 2013, distributed the coffee in the portafilter this way, and became the German Barista Champion. And that approach has now been picked up and integrated right here. And that's an excellent method similar to a single dosing grinder. I find it beautiful how coffee from a single dosing grinder ends up in the portafilter. In that sense, the overall workflow really turns out to be quite efficient.
Yeah, so from there into the portafilter. And then I also think it's nice if you do that, you can leave the cup on and give the portafilter a little shake. And you can see how it creates a flat surface. And the only thing that bothers me a bit is that forms a small ridge in the portafilter, so you need to use some vertical movements like karate moves to evenly spread it out, but honestly, it's really super easy to do.
Then let's just stay with it regardless, because there's something that still kind of bothers me about it.
Yeah, me too.
And sometimes I get the impression that aesthetics, perhaps not more important, but they've really played a significant role here and there, and as a result, we've ended up with some rather silly or strange edge in there. And the coffee just sticks there. That edge doesn't make any sense content-wise.
Yeah, that's just the drive. This wire mesh is at the bottom, and on the side, it has a slider. He makes sure that nothing gets stuck here, and in between there's a small and narrow gap. And by rotating it, it gently pushes the coffee like this straight into the cup. And even if you move it like this, it simply won't fall down. And I always had to make use of this ringing thing. Gently pushing it down a little bit, as it kind of slightly annoyed me sometimes. But then you just push it there in a selective manner. Then you could use the brush again. Yes, it just tends to stick a little. It's somewhat annoying.
Were you, in fact, once really an altar server? I'm just imagining everyone in the entire church using a Weber tabler instead of ringing a bell.
Kind of like a prelude. Now, it's all about espresso time.
Exactly, it just won't.
Exactly, so there. I kind of have the feeling that many aspects needed improvement using small tweaks and adjustments that really aren't bad at all. And then errors occurred again.
Yeah, so for example, this carrier story, or rather this turner here. But once again, we're not discussing grams in this context. No, we're still dealing with this aspect that is actually too distant. But there is this layer of dust here. There is this layer of coffee grounds. And I actually think that it contributes a somewhat negative aspect to the comprehensive aesthetic and workflow experience as a whole. I don't find that one so nice. And then, of course, we are still, and we have to include this in today's conclusion, in a price range of 2,000 francs for a grinder. where, from my perspective, everything should actually be perfect. And then that's a factor I find more problematic. The grinder is incredibly narrow, Michel.
Yes. Just to add briefly, this carrier, you can also do it without it. In the original delivery condition, it comes with this regular plate and there isn't any driver included on it. But you've got even more static charge up there that's sticking around. As a result, the cup ends up being entirely full to the top. There, everything might fall off because there isn't that edge. So it's like choosing between the two. Just a small addition. If you're working with a water spray, specifically referring to RDT, which means pre-wetting the coffee with a fine mist of water before the grinding process, then there is absolutely no retention at all, and no exchange tension either. Everything truly falls down completely because the static charge which initially holds it is broken. But then the coffee sticks here to the drive parts, or rather, not to the drive parts, but on the surface, on the side, because of the water. And you have to give it a little help with your finger.
Yes, of course. I don't think it's possible, then working with water. But on the other hand, I would ask you, does one have to?
If you don't want an interchangeable dead space, yes, if you want to break the statics, that helps, it makes it a bit cleaner. In this tumbler, less tends to get stuck, which is quite handy. I often found myself needing to assist 2 or 3 beans to ensure they made it smoothly into the hole, helping them along the way.
Yeah, but once again, the static isn't so significantly problematic that we have to resort to using water spray.
Using the integrated WDT cleaning tool means you don't have to. Without it, you definitely should. If you're not using this tool, you absolutely need water. Otherwise, the static will be too high.
Yes, well, so once again, I find it really quite special, I have to say. 2,000 francs all over again, and that's pretty much the context here. We indeed still have a lot of static. I must stress, Michel, that effective solutions are now available. How to reduce static, and here you can see this grinder was actually built and there was static in the first generation. Now in the second generation, they tried to improve it with these upgrades, but it has lingered a bit. And doesn't make everything totally smooth.
Let's put it this way, Michael, she's definitely narrow at not even 11 centimeters. And that's only because the front part is noticeably wider than the back. We are at an impressive 35 centimeters in height and a depth of 25 centimeters with a weight of 9 kilos. So that's already...
It's nearly wider than heavy. The cable exits at the back. You can probably turn it on from there too, which is handy and nice to see. And that is also one of our next points, setting the angle forward. Visible also for perhaps individuals who rely on wheelchairs or those who happen to be not very tall in their physical stature. With some grinders, there's the issue that you have to look from above or the grind setting is even at the back. This setup is now quite manageable and straightforward, and it's also relatively precise.
Yes, so firstly, the aspect of repeatability. It's really very impressive. It's absolutely a lot of fun. Once you've gotten that all set up, since there's a grid in place, it results in this situation with numbers like 14 or 12, let's say 2, 4, 6, 8. Yes, exactly, 12.2. If you were to go ahead and calculate that out, it comes back to exactly 12.2 again by itself, because there is nothing in between. At the same time, these steps aren't as large as with a hand grinder, where you change a click and it alters the extraction time by 4 to 5 seconds. But when we talk about it, we mean about 2. So it's really quite pleasant because the changes are small and subtle, which makes the whole process incredibly fun and enjoyable. It's because it's crafted so precisely with these pens, how you change the degree of hardness. It's a bit resinous, maybe. It's fair to say that it requires some effort. You carefully need to lift it, turn it precisely, and perfectly align the pins to make sure it fits securely and correctly. But then you are back at the same point.
With this particular grinder, it will never occur that the grind setting changes all by itself unexpectedly.
No.
Because this is just seamlessly clicked right into place here. We actually have quite a number of grinders in the current test series that might also be are a bit more flexible, enabling a grind size adjustment, partly while grinding and partly when hitting, but not here at all. It's super precise, and we can say that, by the way, from point to point as long as we've worked precisely. And we can also say that regarding the particle distribution, where we always take a look or we always do the test. Set the espresso, note down the grind setting, switch over to ristretto, move on to coffee cream, and then attempt to revert back solely using this setting and make adjustments accordingly. The fine peak was achieved with great precision, and the micron size was now off by just 10, which is genuinely excellent and indeed quite impressive. And with the micron size, we then overall, not with the micron size, I meant to say at the main peak, we were 10 microns off. We definitely need to discuss the main peak, as that's another topic. However, considering how high the main peak really is, 10 appears to be rather few.
Yes. Heat? Heating? Yes, I mean at 90 revolutions.
90 revolutions, large grinding discs, everything is quite openly constructed. So we're looking at how much heating we get from brew to brew when we grind coffee at a higher frequency. And yes, it takes its time, it doesn't get heated, it remains consistent, and that is definitely beneficial. Very good value. So far you notice actually only very, very good values. And that's also what we expect from this grinder.
When we then come to consistency, so if we put in 18 grams, how many grams come out again? We observe a 0.1 fluctuation due to static. It might read 17.9 or be 18, sometimes 18.1, and then drop back to 17.9. It's a somewhat slight back and forth movement, still quite impressive with a 0.1 fluctuation.
Michelle, that's, yes, precisely in that particular area, it is indeed something related to the weighing scale. Does it switch over? Where does it switch over? How much resolution does it have? I would say that's also a very, very good value. When we thoroughly examine the entire service offering, we have reached the conclusion that it is indeed good, but not exceptionally very good. Particularly due to the slightly more complex workflow, which involves ensuring that the grind doesn't fall down here, or making sure that it remains a consistent part of the extraction process. It's not perfect, it definitely could be a little better. That's why, especially in the context of the price, we concluded that it's good, but maybe not exceptionally outstanding.
What truly stands out to me is the feature that enables cleaning. That coming from your mouth? No, because yes, there are things that you have to brush off a bit every now and then, but everything is completely accessible. I don't have to unscrew something. I don't need to open up the cone because I already have inside. I really don't want to know how many exams I've done with it. I found absolutely nothing. Of course, you can take it out at times and gently brush it off a little with a brush. That makes sense. But actually, you can just in between at the bottom where the burrs come together, where the coffee comes out, simply give it a gentle brush off and then it will be thoroughly clean once again. That's really good. I reckon if you tend to use darker roasts, it might be a good idea to occasionally open it up, give it a gentle brush, put it back in, or wipe it with a dry cloth if coffee residue or fat stays inside. I preferred using medium to light roasts. I didn't actually have any residues in there.
Michelle, it's nice of you to say that, and I believe there's no greater accolade for a grinder than receiving commendation on cleaning from you is truly something special. I just wanted to add a quick note here. Did you see? Someone praised the cloth's quality in the last video's comments. You are also known to us as Mr. Rag and have created your own rag set, which I will link below. The cloths received explicit praise for their robustness, as well as their great cleaning potential. And obviously this is on your tab, of course.
Know why, do you?
The potential.
Before we decided to purchase them, they were actively in use at my home.
Here's the current state of affairs. We've discussed a variety of insightful and valuable points. Our evaluation regarding the grinder is mostly green, with dark green clearly marking the very good aspects.
Except for the speed.
Except for the speed, that's really a bright spot in all of this. That's easy, yeah, you need to know this, you should know this. But again, you have the advantages of low volume and so on. Now, naturally, the question is, how's the espresso?
Exactly, and we've genuinely had plenty to drink over there already. We've also already consumed quite a bit of APAs as well. I would now go ahead and brew a limon titler. We'll thoroughly discuss that and also take a detailed look at the information we unearthed on a bus, as well as what our interpretation of the particle distribution actually entails.
Yes, that's how it looks. A lighter espresso. Could you pass me the spoon before I give it away? I'll do that a few more times.
He is good.
He's odd. But I've already been drinking other coffees with this grinder for the past few days. But I think there's now some sweetness. I feel the body isn't as dense.
It's quite light.
I don't really like the aftertaste that much, but I think it's a good espresso.
I carefully placed a total of 19 grams into the portafilter and managed to achieve an extraction of 48 out over a span of 26 full seconds. Limon Titla is more of a fruity coffee. It has a nice sweetness, actually has a nice body. Exactly, so very balanced. Yes.
Exactly. What the coffee's missing now. So again, I think it is one of the best extractions we have tasted. Yes, it is. It's lacking a bit of clarity and body, and it has a slightly dry aftertaste. And then it comes out a bit more like a vegetable flavor. It's not quite as refined.
Yes, and that is connected to our interpretation of the particles distribution. And we need to open a brief window of opportunity to explain this concept to you a bit before we dive deeper. We meticulously measure the entire particle size distribution that each and every individual grinder is capable of producing. Always with the same coffee, always with the same recipe, on the same machine, with the same sieves, and always following the same process. So we'll first we'll grind a grinder, let a good amount of coffee through. You just have to do that if you really want the particle distribution the way it's not after the first 10 extractions, but how it stays later on.
The grinder needs lots of censoring. You really need to let something substantial through, otherwise it's not going to be there at all.
Yeah, so you genuinely need to allow a bit of the material to pass through. And then in the majority of cases, we typically carry out 4 samples of particles. This is set to espresso. Classic recipe with grind size, 18 in, 45 out, plus minus 25 seconds. Let's pull a shot. Then we go to ristretto, very fine. Then we move to a lungo, a slightly longer coffee, and then we go back to the set. Parameters which we can see, and we already know there, that it's consistently achieving the same result. So, what we then go on to measure is an X50 value, which is an average of all measured particles. We measure the fine fraction, specifically all the particles that are under 100 microns expressed in percent. And we measure what's known as a main peak because a curve, specifically a particle distribution curve, always initially starts as a tiny fine peak. Normally that's between 20 and 30, maybe sometimes a little over 30% of fines. And then there's a significant primary peak based on our observations and perception of the latest 70 grinders that we have analyzed.
Yes. So we have now measured 70 grinders, different variants of them, sometimes with different grinding discs, and sometimes ground at a fast speed, once at a slower speed. As a result, we now truly possess a genuine set of data values and have, over the past 3 years, diligently developed and refined a comprehensive flavor profile that corresponds to this data. And we can actually, with a significant degree of precision and accuracy, predict how an espresso is most likely going to taste or determine the flavor range it will generally fall into. What unique characteristics it presents.
This is different here.
Here.
The way the curve is presenting itself is like something we've never observed before.
We've seen the curve resemble this before, or moving in this direction, but not with grinders priced at 2,000 francs. Rather, it's usually with those costing about 200 or so.
Even less.
So, exactly, and perhaps we need to go into a little more detail about the main peak.
Exactly, because if you imagine this largest proportion by quantity of these particles, the more narrow this main peak is, the less distribution you have of various different particle sizes, and thus the clearer, the more structured and reliable the results are likely to be. And we observe this occurring within a range of, let's say, approximately 160 microns in width, extending from those 60% of this main peak, reaching up to somewhere around 280, maybe even 300. The outcome is genuinely delightful.
Certainly, when it's well structured, it results in creating a cup of coffee with a significant amount of clarity and distinctiveness. At times, we've also discovered that when it was below the 200 mark, the coffee couldn't really exhibit its full potential, lacking a bit of its distinct character. And in this range, really from 200 to 300, often in the lower 200s, we've pulled the most delicious espressos so far.
Yep.
Once it goes over 300, something different happened.
Right. And over 300, we had grinders at 330, 340, 350. The results there were all over the place. So unintegrated acids, very sharp, little sweetness added, a furry texture, little body. And our clear interpretation is that anything which exceeds this general range of about 330 or perhaps even 320 is frequently not considered to be very delicious at all. That encapsulates the essence of the classification we've discussed. This particular grinder features a main peak that goes beyond 400, and it is notably characterized by an exceptionally broad, expansive peak that stands out distinctly.
In other words, that thing is incredibly thick and broad. Thus, we are observing a properly pronounced, clearly defined fine peak here. Over 25%, so quite a lot of fines. On the one hand, it's normal with a broad main peak. And then we have particles of that size, of that size, of that size, some of that size, but also, again, some of that size, particularly in the size over there at the back. Those are the boulders, those are the somewhat also coarser particles, which commonly extract less flavor due to the roughness of their texture. And that's the core issue here. We definitely have many of those, and people often notice it, so please feel free to share in the comments if you've picked up on it when using this grinder. You can already see that when you put the coffee into the portafilter. There are particles around. With another grinder just set finer.
So that's exactly how it was for me at home. I adjusted it there for a fresh coffee, took a look, and immediately thought, wow, that's really much too coarse. And
then you have the fine particles, and then you have these medium particles and all that. And they ensure that the grinding level is correct and consistent, even though the coarser particles are still lying around back there.
then they fall off at the back.
Michel, it changes in the extraction, correct?
That's correct, because when there's such a wide distribution and a significant amount at the back end, especially in this very coarse area, which is known as the boulder area, we end up extracting less. That's the interpretation. And what we then decided to do is, we can't just interpret it, we can actually measure it too. And we stood there carrying out extractions from both the light and dark roasts, particularly a medium roast and a lighter coffee. We then meticulously measured and carefully recorded the TDS in each of these prepared samples. So, what exactly is the coffee to water ratio for this setup?
Calculated the extraction process thoroughly in order to see exactly how much we actually extracted out of the coffee bean. Well, that's our goal, of course. We want to extract a lot from one bean. Usually, at least if it's tasty, then higher extractions are actually desirable. And that works especially when you have relatively many smaller particles, or in the medium size, I'd say, rather than the main bend. When you have a lot of it, you can extract a lot. When they're just lying around here, it's not so easy for the water in the short time that an espresso extraction takes. 25 seconds despite 9 bar pressure to get into these particles, to dissolve everything, and then become part of the espresso afterwards. That means typically when we have a lot of boulders, we have lower extractions. Got taste too. What's he like?
It's generally more on the sour side. Depending on the batch, there's often that slightly dusty texture, and it tends to have an overall unbalanced feel to it. So achieving the perfect balance between sweet and sour is incredibly challenging to master. Yes, indeed. And we can clearly say today, you are able to solve less output, full stop. There's absolutely nothing to debate about. We made this comparison using a typical household budget-friendly grinder, specifically the Eureka Specialita model. So it's genuinely a grinder positioned in the price range of somewhere around 500 euros, equipped with a classic burr set, simply representing what we interpret as a really good, reliable, and solid grinder. And with APAS, we've observed a significantly lower TDS of 0.8 and above, highlighting an extraction yield that is more than 2% less than what we typically achieve. That means we typically refer to a target range, often between 18 and 22%, as this usually indicates a good and proper extraction process. And if then, for example, it was off target, very often with this grinder at a little over 18%, like really scraping the bottom range, and exactly the same recipe, exactly the same parameters to ensure it is truly fair, and then, of course, calculated accordingly. Even self-produced quantities always have small deviations. You calculate that using a formula. And on average, we've ended up releasing just a bit more than 2% less than expected.
Certainly, we were lacking the essential texture, and additionally, we were missing the weight and body, especially in terms of the mouthfeel. Furthermore, there was a lack of the clarity that we desired for the cup. And certain acids in particular were really quite unpleasant, incredibly unpleasant. Meanwhile, the darker coffees seemed to perform much better since they inherently provided a distinct and unique texture, might have needed a little more body and perhaps even a bit of acidity on their own. And I mean, in this field, from this area, that's where these conical grinding discs come in, grinding mechanisms, or it's called a conical grinding cone. They're basically at home there. That's precisely why I'm not too surprised by it, but what genuinely surprises me is just how infrequently it's actually discussed in the broader market context. And that's why we were also quite relieved to see, after we tasted the coffee, when we then saw the particle distribution, we said, to be honest, I thought it was a bit extreme, how wide they are. On the other hand, I thought, yeah, okay.
It definitely makes sense. Oh, and interestingly enough, for instance, this TDS difference was a bit smaller with light coffee. So we were at about 0.5 TDS. Exactly. That was then about 1 to 1.5% less in extraction potential. It consistently shows lower measurements. This suggests and indicates that the grinder is likely more suited and specifically intended for brewing darker types of coffee.
I agree.
And that with a darker roast, which inherently, as Benjamin already mentioned, brings less acidity, you can still work in a certain acidity and create a balance, which you can theoretically do with another grinder with a shorter extraction time. Exactly, but that is essentially our interpretation and understanding of this particular result and the way the particle distribution is structured.
That's correct. If you need more information, read about it, or examine the data closely, be sure to check the blog description for more extensive and detailed insights. We've summarized that for you and also show the different curves that we have measured.
Just a quick additional note regarding that, we also conducted this TDS measurement at the very lowest RPM that was achievable. We engaged in playing around with the highs and the lows. Ultimately, you end up triggering a TDS response that's very similar indeed. So the TDS remains more or less constant, whether you're at a speed of 30 revolutions or going at 150 revolutions. The quantity of dissolved particles in the cup remains consistently the same. You'll definitely have to modify the grind size. That's quite clear, but when you reduce the RPM, which means having fewer revolutions per minute, you end up in a coarser range. By doing that, we effectively end up extracting an equally lesser amount. That's really then in brewing.
Yes, that's the particle distribution you're speaking of, and that's also what we observe when it comes to discussing the flavor. So based on our thorough assessment, the flavor potential of the grinder is unfortunately rated as rather poor. So, with what we anticipate, the possibilities we envision, what we desire in a coffee we are familiar with, the result in the cup compelled us to conclude that it's simply not good. Not at all in the way we expect. Definitely not in the manner that supports the way we really want and intend to make coffee. And not in the way that the extensive range or the broad scope of the coffee selection really demands. There are grinders available, and perhaps we are gradually moving towards the conclusion, Michel, a bit like assessing the market. So this is not my endgame. Because I have the feeling that there's a sense of, at least when it comes to taste potential, you can definitely, without a doubt, find such a beautiful machine for a lot less money. High quality construction, totally quiet, you can keep sleeping right next to it when someone is on the sofa. But when it comes to the flavor potential, even if I consider how many affordable, genuinely good single-dosing grinders are now available for less than 1,000 euros, or roughly around the 1,000 euro mark, with flat burrs and with conical burrs. And what additional possibilities do I have to explore and experiment with by using different burrs or grinding discs that can further enhance or alter the final outcome, to steer the taste in a different direction? I have to say, and that's why we didn't rate it so highly, the espresso potential is simply not very positive from my perspective. And that's very diplomatically phrased.
Yes, I can only agree with you. I find them absolutely fantastic, really beautiful and very well made. I eventually got accustomed to the workflow after approximately 1 week, but I didn't get used to the taste. And I was really excited when I swapped another grinder, and the next one, which will appear in the next video at some point. At home, I prepared an espresso and thought, yes, there's our coffee once again. This is precisely how it's supposed to taste.
Yeah, so I would genuinely say here, if you were to ask me, it's this one or another grinder that comes with a conical burr.
A distinct niche.
I would say the niche.
Not in processing.
No, okay, clearly not. However, the seal's still intact.
Yep.
After 6 years.
Yes, there's a lot of plastic on it for sure, and it's all much higher quality, but taste-wise, we get more out of it. We've thoroughly backed this up with an abundance of data, ensuring you don't feel like it's merely Gauman, Benjamin, and myself saying it.
So we're also scared. When everyone always raves about the grinder or expresses themselves very diplomatically between the lines.
I'd say probably more diplomatic.
All right.
Many diplomatic videos. We are the diplomats. We say what we think. I'm telling you very clearly right now, if it had been my own 2,000 francs, I would be extremely, extremely disappointed.
What?
Yes. Everything else not, but I would be really disappointed with the taste. And if I weren't in this sensory certainty like I am today, I would question myself as a barista and not the grinder.
That's the conclusion. But it's an honest one, and we wanted to share it with you today, and as always, that's what we're doing. And that's how we did it here too. Maybe you've had completely different experiences with the grinder. Then please write to us in the comments. Maybe you are excited. You might also be quite grateful that we articulated it today in the particular way we decided to. We're looking forward to your feedback and eager to hear your thoughts. Otherwise, we wish you an enjoyable time. Take care of yourselves. Drink good espresso.